Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Happy to be here to talk about environmental policy and how we should think about it. I'm going to talk probably for about 45 minutes or so. Danger of having a law professor in a room without a clock. Just keep going. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions and comments and discussion. And what I want to try and do today is suggest that a lot of the ways we think about how we should deal with environmental problems are based on some faulty premises, and in particular, the general assumption that we need or want federal leadership for the majority of environmental problems is not a well-founded idea. It's based on some misunderstandings of our own history, failure to consider the ways in which different levels of government interact with one another and the sort of incentives they face, and that thinking through these sorts of questions is necessary if we're going to have the sorts of solutions to environmental problems that we want to have, not just for ourselves, but for our children and going forward. Now, I'm at Case Western Reserve University, that's in Cleveland. I've been talking about environmental law or environmental policy coming from Cleveland. I feel I have a few things I have to get out of the way right off the bat, and that's particularly true given that it's 2019. We have a river in Cleveland, Cuyahoga River. Some of you may have heard of it. It's featured in an REM song. It had an infamous event 50 years ago this June. Some oil and debris floating on the surface of the river caught fire. And that seems to be the sort of environmental event that was jarring to people. Rivers catching fire, or if you want to be more precise, things floating on rivers catching fire. It's not usually the way we like to think about how we're going to handle our environmental resources. And it became something of an event. Time magazine published this photo that summer. That's not the condition we like to think of our rivers being in. Randy Newman, I don't have the Randy Newman quote. Randy Newman did a song about the fire as well. And this was quite an event in that it got covered in the New York Times, National Geographic, Time magazine, and this was seen as a symbol of how bad environmental problems had become. That by June of 1969, we could have a river engulfed in flames, and this was a sign of how poorly we were treating our environment.
And to the few of us that were alive at that time, they didn't get that thing under control for a long time.
Well, actually, that's not true.
Really?
Yes. So it turns out, this is what Time magazine published. This is what appeared in the Cleveland papers. Story of a couple inches, and this picture. If you get a better reproduction of this picture, you can maybe see a little smoke here. No fire. It turns out, this is not a picture of the 1969 fire. It is the picture Time magazine published. It is a picture that until several years ago, after doing some research on this and going on a bit of a crusade, could be found on the EPA website, could be found on the website of major environmental groups, as representing the storied fire of June 22nd, 1969. This is actually the closest thing we have to what actually occurred in Cleveland in June of 1969. The fire was out in under 30 minutes. It caused some damage to the railroad trestle. It was not a big deal in Cleveland. So the obvious question is, where did this picture come from? Because in 1969, they didn't have Photoshop. This is a real picture. This is a river engulfed in flames. So the question is, if it's not from the 1969 fire, where did it come from? Well, it came from an earlier fire, one from 1952, a real inferno. A fire that, had it not occurred on a weekend, would almost certainly have resulted in substantial loss of life, caused substantial damage. The story notes that it hit multiple docks, 3 tugs were destroyed. This was a fire. 17 years earlier. Apparently, the picture that ran in the local papers wasn't sensational enough for Time's story about the state of the environment, and they pulled the picture from much earlier. The interesting thing is, if you want to talk about fires on rivers, we can talk about the fire of 1952. in Cleveland, we can talk about fires going back into the 30s. We can talk about fires going back to the 19 teens. In fact, we can go back talking about fires in the 19th century, the late 1800s, when Standard Oil was developing in and around Cleveland. You can find accounts of fires on the river being something of a common occurrence. If any of you have read Titan, the biography of John Rockefeller, it talks about this phenomenon. But it turns out it wasn't just Cleveland, which is thankful for my adopted city is not the only place where we had river fires. We had them in Columbus, we had them in New York, we had them in Philadelphia, we had them in Baltimore, we had them, in fact, throughout the country in the late 19th and early 20th century. Heavily industrialized rivers would catch fire, or again, more accurately, would collect debris and chemicals and other things on their surface, which would in turn catch fire with some regularity. What was different by 1969 was not that things had gotten so bad that suddenly rivers could be the sites of fires, but that this was a problem that actually had been quite serious and quite common, that we had solved and largely forgotten. In Cleveland, there hadn't been a fire on the Cuyahoga in 17 years. Most of the accounts of fires on other rivers in other parts of the country are in the first half of the 20th century. This is something that had been a common problem, but that had been addressed. In Cleveland, primarily by the efforts of both local government and local business leaders who realized that having things catch fire on a river that you're trying to use for other things, that's a source of economic activity for the city where there's lots of things of value, is a threat to those things, is a threat to people, and is something that you should do something about, and they did. I tell this story in part because it's representative of a fairly common fable that we tell about environmental protection and the history of environmental protection in the United States. I'm back to that. Slides are out of order. Sorry about that. The standard fable goes something like this. Federal environmental regulation was a necessary response to the failure of states, localities, and private organizations to address environmental concerns. And the reason why the Cuyahoga River fire story fits into that, one, it's given as an example of this all the time. Again, EPA itself used to give this as an example. It is cited as, the Cuyahoga River fire is cited as one of the reasons we passed the Clean Water Act in 1972, we passed the National Environmental Policy Act in 1970. It is pointed to as one of the reasons why President Nixon reorganized aspects of the executive branch to create the EPA in 1970 in the first place. And the idea was that we needed this federal intervention because state and local governments, private organizations, others were simply ignoring environmental problems until they got so bad that we had events like the 1969 fire in Cuyahoga. As I just explained, that's actually not what happened with river fires, and it turns out that's actually not the history we see with lots of environmental issues. So we can talk about wetlands. I've done a bunch of my own research is focused on wetlands. We can look at losses of wetlands. This is the data that's produced by various federal agencies. The time periods are weird because it's when they bother to put out reports. Unfortunately, it's not as systematic as we'd like it to be. This is wetland loss trends in the post-war period. Prior to 1954, we were losing wetlands at about 800,000 acres per year. That declines to the mid-90s. We actually reached no net loss of wetlands in the United States, measured by acreage. And in fact, for much of the 90s, we were actually gaining net acreage of wetlands because this data doesn't count a lot of the wetland restoration that occurs in the country. What's interesting about these trends is, one, well, we're in an agricultural state. Certainly have to point out that part of what's going on in the background during this period is agricultural productivity is increasing dramatically. We're growing a lot more on an acre of land than we had before, and that dramatically reduces the pressure to take wetlands and to convert them to cropland. And you combine that with the fact that the wetlands that were converted to cropland first were those where that alternative potential use of that land was the greatest. That's also contributing to this trend. But what about the role of regulation here? Well, 1975, court decision called NRDC versus Callaway, where a district court in Washington, D.C. tells the Army Corps of Engineers and the US EPA that the Clean Water Act applies to wetlands. Prior to 1975, the Army Corps' position was the Clean Water Act would not. So there's no federal government effort to regulate wetlands at all until 1975. It's not until 1985 that reforms are made to federal agricultural programs to no longer be subsidizing the destruction of wetlands for agricultural purposes. Through much of the 20th century, the federal government was not only not protecting wetlands, but was actively subsidizing their conversion to other uses, not just cropland. It's not until 1993 that the federal government tries to close a major loophole in wetland regulation with something called the Tulloch Rule. And I'm going to oversimplify, but basically, the Clean Water Act prohibits adding things to waters of the United States. So in the case of wetlands, you can't deposit, dredge, or fill material to a wetland. It does not prohibit taking things out. So in a lot of cases, for many types of wetlands, what this means is that if you want to convert that land to something else, you want to build something on it, you want to grow something on it, if you can drain it so it's no longer a wetland, then you can fill it. And it wasn't until 1993 that the federal government tried to close that loophole. That rule ends up getting thrown out in court as being beyond the scope of what the Clean Water Act authorizes. What's interesting about this history is that state regulation of wetlands begins in 1963. The state of Massachusetts becomes the first state to begin regulating wetlands for the ecological values. And Massachusetts law is based on pre-existing local zoning laws that were incorporating environmental protection of wetlands even prior to that. So while it's certainly true through much of our nation's history, we did not care enough about wetlands. We didn't know enough about them. We thought about them as marshes and fens and swamps and places where dangerous animals lived and where were associated with all sorts of negative stereotypes and conceptions of the sort of people that lived in wetlands and so on. When we started protecting wetlands, it wasn't the federal government that came in and said, states, you need to solve this. It was in fact states that said, we're going to start protecting these, and the federal government comes in much later. And there's an argument that when the federal government began protecting wetlands with the Clean Water Act, that Congress wasn't even clear that that's what they were doing, which is one of the reasons why it was litigated in federal court. We can talk about, if we're talking about the Clean Water Act more broadly, we can also talk about other water pollution trends prior to enactment of the Clean Water Act. The EPA's first clean water quality inventory finds that for the pollutants of greatest concern, that trends were positive in the decade prior to the adoption of the Clean Water Act. There's another new study that just came out pointing out that for the types of water pollution we were concerned about when we enacted the Clean Water Act, we were beginning to see dramatic improvement prior to the enactment of federal regulation. We can look at air pollution. This is data for sulfur dioxide concentrations. It's important that this is concentrations, not emissions, or this is what's in the air that we breathe. This is the three time series are those that we have from the federal government for this period. What's interesting about this, Clean Air Act was adopted in 1970. The blue trend line of what we see post-enactment of the Clean Air Act is actually reductions at a slower rate than prior to adoption of the Clean Air Act. It's not because the Clean Air Act slowed down the reductions, it's because of what economists call diminishing marginal returns. It's easier to clean up, maybe the first increments of improvement. Squeezing out additional levels of improvement just becomes progressively harder. So I'm not claiming the Clean Air Act slowed down the rate at which we were reducing air pollution in our cities. It's that the trends of the improvement began prior to enactment of the 1970 Clean Air Act. And we can tell the same story in a lot of places. That in fact, the environmental progress that we saw through the 70s, 80s, and 90s actually began in case after case before the federal government began taking these issues seriously. It wasn't that the federal government was coming in and addressing state and local neglect or private neglect. It was rather building on actions that state and local governments had already taken. If we want to talk about what's the actual pattern that we see across issue after issue, it looks more like this. One is period of perception. For a lot of environmental problems, it is amazing to discover what we used to think about when we didn't know any better. 115 years ago, you could find people that believed smoke would help inoculate you from TB. We know now that's nuts. There were points in time when we weren't aware about the parts per million or parts per billion of certain contaminants and the health risks that pose. We weren't aware of the way that certain things might cause or contribute to cancer. In the case of wetlands, we weren't aware of the role they play in filtering water, buffering storms, providing important habitat for various species, and the various ecological benefits they provide. For any environmental problem, one of the things that's really important in evaluating our ability and the extent to which we address that problem is identifying when we actually understood it was a problem. When I was doing my research on the Cuyahoga River, I could find accounts from the 1920s where people would see these prismatic pools on the surface of the river, and they didn't go, "Oh my God, that's so terrible." They said, "This is a sign of prosperity." Some of you may have older relatives, grandparents, and so on, who would talk about working in towns where when the skies were gray, that was seen as a good thing because it meant the mills were open. Now for us, that's a very odd way of viewing the world, right? But the point is that how we evaluate whether we're addressing environmental problems is in part function of to recognize those things as a problem and that we want to deal with. And the reality is a lot of things that we recognize as problems today, we didn't always recognize as problems, either because we lacked the scientific knowledge or because our values were different, because we had prioritized other things. And so first we notice there's always a period of perception. And what's the interesting thing is that typically that perception comes locally. Despite the expertise we expect the federal government to have, we typically see local communities that are actually experiencing the environmental problem, recognize the environmental problem first. In the case of wetlands, I don't think it's a surprise that the states with the most wetlands, the state were the ones that understood what it meant to lose wetlands. The states that have the various types of industries most dependent on the things that wetlands provide, that became aware first that, hey, losing these wetlands is actually a problem for us. If it affects our fish populations, if it affects our wildlife populations, if it affects our recreational opportunities, if it affects our water quality, if it affects our resilience against storms. We would expect the people that are in position to experience those things to recognize those problems first. And typically, on issue after issue, we tend to see attempts and actions at the state and local level where those problems are occurring before we see federalization or the federal government get involved. And again, we see that on issue after issue after issue. The knowledge that something's a problem tends to first be generated where that problem is, and then the effort to address it at that level begin first, and then federalization tends to come later. So now these questions, well, why did we get to federalism? Why did we not just leave things at the state and local level? Why, if this table isn't true, if it wasn't that the federal government was the necessary response to the failure of states and localities to address environmental concerns, maybe it was a lack of ability. It wasn't that they weren't trying, it's that they weren't able. And for some environmental issues, that might be true. But I think the story here is a bit more complicated as well. If we look at why we got federalization of environmental concerns, and when we did, I think we identify factors that are hard to square with this traditional account. So what are some of them? Well, one of them was increased environmental awareness. In the post-war period, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, environmental values became much more widespread and widely embraced than they had been before. Particularly environmental values beyond what we might think of as traditional conservation. There certainly was a long history in the United States of a conservation tradition, often centered around hunting and the like, but the environmental movement that today we know encompasses a much wider range of issues and concerns, and that really developed in the 1960s and 70s. The first Earth Day was in 1970. A lot of books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and the like helped popularize the idea that the things that were giving us economic prosperity were also producing environmental costs that we were no longer willing to accept. We no longer viewed the chemicals on the surface of a river as a sign of progress. We viewed that as a despoilation of something that was important to us and that we wanted further values. And so there's no question that as a nation, we began to think about environmental values much differently. Deindustrialization probably played a role. There's a paper by a couple of historians in environmental history that talks about how deindustrialization changed the politics as well as the perception of a lot of environmental problems. As fewer people and fewer communities were dependent upon traditional industrial activity for their well-being, there was a greater willingness to understand and acknowledge the environmental costs that that industrial activity produced. And that certainly had broad cultural effects. Our politics became increasingly nationalized in the 1960s. The presidential campaigns of Richard Nixon, particularly in 1972, were in part driven by environmental issues. There was actually, Richard Nixon and Ed Muskie got into something of a bidding war leading up to the enactment of the 1970 Clean Air Act about who could endorse a more far-reaching, more aggressive piece of federal legislation. The Nixon administration embraced a lot of environmental measures. But our politics were increasingly nationalized during this period of time. Things that used to be local problems were now things that could be national stories. All of those river fires that occurred all over the country in the late 1900s and the early 20th century weren't national stories. They weren't in national news magazines. National news magazines didn't exist in the same way they did by the 1960s. The ability of local stories to become national stories was just something that hadn't been the case before. So a lot of environmental events that were certainly quite significant and meaningful didn't have the same national purchase. We didn't know about them as a nation. Another thing I think is very important in terms of this time period, there was a very well-deserved distrust of state governments in particular, and of our institutions of federalism at the time that this environmental awareness was booming. If states couldn't be trusted to protect the people in their states, if states weren't willing to protect portions of their citizenry based on the color of their skin, why would we trust states to deal with other social problems in a fair and just and reliable way? The idea that state governments could be relied upon to be useful means of addressing various problems was at its low point, and for very good reason. And so a lot of the arguments that were made politically about, well, you can leave a lot of these issues in state hands, they didn't have the resonance anymore because of what we were seeing states do in so many areas. And I certainly think that contributed to why we got federalization when we did, because when people were demanding greater environmental protection and looking for levels of government to deal with environmental protection, they were less trusting of states to be the level of government that would help address these problems. And then another cause that we sometimes don't think about enough that occurred is rent-seeking. What's rent-seeking? I'm a professor in my class. You talk about rent-seeking in your class?
Next week.
Next week, okay. So this is your little preview of rent-seeking. So here's my non-economist lawyer's characterization of rent-seeking. The expenditure of scarce resources to capture an artificially created transfer. It's pretty good. Is that a good enough economic definition? All right. So what does that really mean? Instead of trying to build a better widget or provide a better service, you figure out a way to guarantee yourself a share of the market or by changing the rules. You get the government to give you a subsidy. You get the government to tax your competitors. You get the government to enact a rule that governs your industry that benefits you at the expense of others. And so we typically associate rent-seeking with special interest politics and with good reason. And the thing is to keep in mind here, right? Business seeks profit, not competition. And if there are things that reduce competition but increase profit, businesses typically are happy to pursue that. Now, what does it have to do with federalization? Well, it's really interesting. as I showed you already, despite what we tend to think, a lot of states were trying to do a lot of things on environmental policy. They were leading the way on protecting wetlands. They were leading the way on trying to reduce water pollution. They were leading the way on trying to reduce air pollution. They had dealt with the issue of river fires before the federal government came along. As I mentioned, businesses seek profit, not competition. They want to find ways of reducing competition. And in the area of air pollution, one of the things we see is that states were beginning to realize that our love affair with the automobile has costs, has consequences. And California was among the first to deal with this, both because of California's famed freeways. I don't know about any of you, but when I took driver's ed a while ago now, all the videos that we saw were like these Walt Disney movies from the 1950s about, when everyone just thought of California's freeways as the model of what you wanted. And the number of people in California, the number of cars, combining some things about the topography of Southern California in particular, meant that automobiles were causing major air pollution problems in Southern California. And Southern California, in particular California, began looking at this and realizing that their air pollution problems were a result of the love affair with the automobile. Well, California could do various things to try and solve this problem. They could tell Californians, you can't drive as much. That wouldn't be very popular. They could prohibit people from buying cars. That would be very popular. What they decided to do instead was to say, well, why don't we tell the people that are making the cars, who aren't in California, that if they want to sell their cars in California, those cars are going to have to meet emission standards. So California becomes the first jurisdiction in the United States to adopt vehicle emission standards years before there was any federal authority to do anything like that. Now, California wasn't the only state that was having air pollution problems. It wasn't the only state where the air pollution problems were being exacerbated by automobiles. And so other states are like, oh, well, this is an idea. Maybe we should do this too. If the problem is that cars are too dirty, then maybe we should require that cars would be cleaner as well. Well, this didn't sit very well with the automakers. The business model of General Motors and Ford and the like was, when the car rolls off the assembly plant in Pontiac, Michigan, you should be able to sell it anywhere in the country. And they shouldn't have to design a different car for California than for Kansas or Montana or Maine or wherever else. And so the automakers went to Congress and said, you need to adopt a national standard so that we don't have different standards in different states. They also said, and rather than you Congress set the standard, give it to an agency so we can get lost in the bowels of bureaucracy for several years, so we get some more time before we actually have to comply. The deal that ends up getting struck is California, because its rules were already in the books, gets grandfathered in. Every other state, to this day, is precluded from adopting its own vehicle emission standards. And California still has to actually ask permission when it wants to make certain types of changes in its standards. So Kansas has the choice. Kansas can allow people to buy the cars that meet the federal standards, or Kansas can adopt the California standard. Kansas cannot come up with standards of its own. And the reason is because the automakers, and they're trying to figure out what to do about states being too aggressive about air pollution control, got the idea that what they needed was a national standard to preempt state and local standards. It turns out there's a lot of areas where we see similar stories, where large national industries decided that state and local rules that in many cases may have been tailored to the local conditions or particular concerns in particular states were bad for their business model, and that having federal regulation, one size for the entire nation, or one standard for the entire nation, would be a better idea than allowing different states to do different things. And we can talk about scrubber mandates for factories and power plants, and what are called PSD requirements, prevention of significant deterioration requirements. There's some great research looking at the Clean Air Act of 1977 in particular, showing how regional industries were able to use these regulations to prevent competition from other parts of the country. We see things like standards for paints, for oil tankers, and we see a lot of efforts to preempt tort suits for various products because of their environmental harms at the federal level. So there are lots of examples where federal regulation is pursued precisely because state and local governments might be doing too much in the eyes of industry. It doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain all the federal environmental laws. Nowhere close, but it explains a lot more than we sometimes are willing to recognize. Now I should note, just because rent seeking exists doesn't mean, well, I know two things about rent seeking. One, a lot of times we get a phenomenon that's often referred to as Baptists and bootleggers in rent seeking. This is from an economist named Bruce Yandel. The story he tells is that both bootleggers and Baptists favor statutes that shut down liquor stores on Sunday. The Baptists because of their religious preferences, the bootleggers because it expands their market. The bootleggers like being the only game in town, the only folks that can sell alcohol on Sunday. The Baptists like reducing alcohol consumption. We see something similar in environmental policy sometimes. Right? There may be an industry that wants a regulation that prohibits its competition, that requires products to meet a particular standard that one company can meet but others cannot. And that might be supported by environmental groups, whose reasons are not economic, but are moral or normative or policy-based, and they may think that that's a decent trade. And we see that phenomenon a lot in environmental policy, the coalition of environmental organizations and economically interested entities pursuing the same goal. When I think about some current issues in the context of energy policy, we certainly see renewable energy firms often supporting environmental organizations or the same policies as environmental organizations and opposing higher carbon fuel sources and the like. One thing which I note about the story is that the existence of the story tells us nothing about whether or not the underlying policy is a good idea or a bad idea. It just tells us something about the political dynamic that's driving the adoption of the regulation. So one example of Baptists and bootleggers producing an outcome that I think was certainly a good outcome involves chlorofluorocarbons. Chlorofluorocarbons were developed by DuPont. DuPont had the patents for CFCs. Among other things, chlorofluorocarbons help reduce the stratospheric ozone layer and contributed to a hole in the ozone layer. That's important because stratospheric ozone blocks ultraviolet B radiation, and that's good for us because increased exposure to UVB radiation can increase skin cancer. It can also have certain ecological effects. And in the 1980s, there was a big push to try and get rid of CFCs. And the United States was very much against this push for a while. DuPont was very against this push. And it turns out the United States changed its position on the global phase out of CFCs when DuPont's patents for CFCs expired and when it had filed patents for their replacement. And it's pretty clear that one of the things that drove the change in our policy was that economically, phasing out of CFCs went from a very costly proposition to a proposition that at least had a potential economic upside. Now, from an environmental standpoint, glad it happened. Maybe I don't like the fact that DuPont got rich off or not, but the reality is it was a good thing to do environmentally. So the point of noting the rent-seeking phenomenon, again, is just to note that this is a way to understand the political economy that often leads to environmental policies, but we still need to evaluate them separately. Right? People may support good ideas for bad reasons, just as people may support bad ideas for good reasons. And that's certainly true in environmental policy. Now, I've talked a bit about why we got federalization and some of the factors that drove behind that. What I want to talk about briefly is why I think that federalization has some downsides, what some of the benefits of a decentralized environmental policy are, say a little bit about what are reasonable justifications for federal intervention, and then a tiny bit about kind of where we go from here. And I'm going to do all of that in about 15 minutes, so we have time for some questions. So first, what are some benefits of decentralization? I think we can draw a lot of these from the history of environmental protection in the United States about what some of these benefits are. One I've already noted to is what F.A. Hayek, the Nobel laureate economist, referred to as the knowledge problem. The idea that it's very hard to have centralized knowledge about all the details of the sorts of decisions we want to make economically. If that's true economically, that's even more true environmentally. Because environmental problems involve all of the economic concerns we're concerned about, because it's usually economic activity that's producing the environmental problem, combined with the environmental effects of those decisions. And as we learned with wetlands and other things, the knowledge about the environmental effects of our actions is often understood and noticed locally first. So we want institutions that are in a position to identify what it is we know about or can learn about the environmental effects of our activities, and that's very hard to centralize that information and that knowledge in some sort of centralized entity, some sort of centralized bureaucracy. The knowledge problem is the primary reason that central economic planning failed. If central economic planning can't work, central environmental planning is an even dicier proposition. Another benefit is fostering innovation. Environmental problems are hard. Environmental problems usually result from people doing something to meet a human need. Provide energy, provide housing, provide products that make our lives better. And the environmental problem is the unintended, undesired consequence or side effect. Make our cell phones. We've got to mine the rare metals that are used in the electronics. That has significant environmental consequences. We should care about that. But we have that problem because we have the phone. And we want institutions that encourage us to find better ways of solving problems. And finding better ways of solving problems typically requires a lot of trial and error. We don't like to put all of our eggs in one basket. We like lots of different institutions and entities trying different things. And so when it comes to government policy, if we're doing everything out of Washington, D.C., we're getting a lot less innovation, we're getting a lot less experimentation, and a lot less learning about what's going to work and what's going to fail. There are lots of environmental policies we've tried over the last 50 years that were disasters, that produced all sorts of unintended side effects. Mandating fuel additives that you have to add to gas, or that oil companies have to add to gasoline to increase the oxygen content, that turn out contaminating groundwater in large portions of the United States. Right? That wasn't what they meant to do. And allowing jurisdictions to try and develop and experiment with their own policies is a way of encouraging greater innovation. Because we can learn from the fact that Kansas might try and do one thing, and Nebraska might try and do something else, and other states can look at that and say, okay, we're going to follow the model of the one that worked, and we're not going to follow the model of the one that failed. Another benefit of decentralization is that preferences vary. People in Montana have different preferences than people in Texas, than people in Kansas. People in Massachusetts and California have different preferences than people in Alabama or Wyoming. And a lot of times those preferences are about purely subjective things. We may say that people may care about the environment in all these different places, but what they mean by that is going to be different. And a lot of our environmental preferences really are preferences about what we want in the world around us. I spend a lot of time in Montana. Go out to Montana and you talk to people about what's important in Yellowstone National Park. And some people will say, it's really important to have rules. Rules are cool. Get a chance to see a wolf in the wild, do it. You have to usually get up really early in the morning. But it's worth it. It's like awesome. Okay? Now, I have some friends out there that are elk hunters. They're not so big on the wolves. Turns out, within the Yellowstone ecosystem, you can maximize for wolves or you can maximize for elk. You can't do both. Turns out if you maximize for wolves, you can maximize for aspen trees, which are pretty, but you can't maximize for wolves. They, in some respects, right? They don't always get along. And it turns out from an ecological standpoint, we can find different periods in ecological history of that ecosystem where we can find elk populations being really high or wolf populations being really high. And it's not that one of them is natural, it's that in ecological cycles at different points in time produce different relative levels. My friends, the elk hunters, and my friends that, like me, like charismatic megafauna, which is just a fancy way of saying pretty cuddly animals that we like to look at. Right? We have different preferences. And one of the things about decentralized institutions is it allows us a greater chance of satisfying more people's preferences. of saying that we don't have to try to maximize the same things in every place. We only have one Yellowstone, but Yellowstone's not the only place where we can have elk and we can have wolves. And when we talk about other environmental problems that often press against each other. There's certain types of when you deal with certain environmental problems, you sometimes affect other environmental problems. We can do more to satisfy our preferences. I think we ensure better accountability. That state and local governments, because they are less anonymous, because they are closer, because people in those institutions are more likely to live in the same communities, neighborhoods as the rest of us, are more likely to be accountable. We're going to be perfectly accountable. It's a question of compared to what? And the evidence that we have suggests that state and local governments tend to be more responsive to local concerns than folks in Washington, D.C. There's also an issue of ecologies of scale, which is most of the environmental problems that we deal with, most, not all, certainly not all, are local or regional in nature. And we often need to be able to deal with them at the level at which they occur. And adopting policies in a centralized way that apply nationally often means that we are driving policy based on the concerns of a particular region or a particular place. And that may not be appropriate for the country as a whole. Chesapeake Bay watershed matters a lot to the states that are part of that watershed. And there are things that need to be done to protect that will have success, and we want to be able to pay attention to those sorts of differences. So there are lots of benefits of decentralization. And so the question then is, what is the federal role? When is federal intervention most appropriate versus when it should be left to the states? And how am I on time? Okay. Go through these slides relatively quickly. So there are some arguments that are often put forward for why we would want federal intervention. And I was going to quickly go through what those are and explain which ones are good ones and which ones are not so good ones. The best one around is that pollution doesn't respect state lines. In Ohio, we have a bunch of coal plants. And for a variety of reasons, a lot of those coal plants have really tall smokestacks. And that means a lot of the bad effects of those coal plants don't stay in Ohio. And we're really nice in Ohio, but we're not so nice that we're likely to adopt regulations in Ohio that impose costs in Ohio for the benefit of people upwind, or downwind, sorry. Downwind, but kind of in the upper northeast. We're not that nice. And we recognize that, well, whatever we think about the likelihood of a jurisdiction dealing with problems that are felt within that jurisdiction, we can't expect jurisdictions to deal with the problems that cross the limit. So this is an unimpeachable, fabulous argument for federal intervention. The problem is that when we look at statutes we adopted in the beginning of 1969, we don't see very many provisions that deal with interstate spillovers. Very little of the Clean Air Act deals with interstate spillovers. Very little of the Clean Water Act deals with interstate spillovers. None of CERCLA, none of RCRA, none of the Safe Drinking Water Act. There's a really good argument that the federal government needs to be there when upwind or upstream jurisdiction imposes the environmental costs on downwind, downstream jurisdiction. The problem is that we can't explain very much of what we have based on that. There's relatively little of existing federal environmental regulation deals with interstate spillovers. Maybe arguments for national public goods. I mentioned Yellowstone before. We may think that even though Yellowstone itself is in Wyoming and Montana, that it has public good properties that benefit the nation as a whole. That might be true. There might be regulations we need to help address that. Turns out there's one power plant in Arizona that is responsible for a disproportionate amount of the haze in Grand Canyon. The regulation to prevent that probably makes sense, and it might need to be federal. But typically, if we're concerned about public goods, we encourage the production of public goods by subsidizing them. Regulation doesn't have much to say about how we provide these national public goods, and then there's an empirical question about whether or not national public goods like parks and species habitat and the like are better provided by government or an alternative means. Again, that's an empirical question. I don't think it tells us much about regulation, in particular pollution control regulation, the sort we have. Well, one of it is technical expertise. There's a lot of technical expertise in Washington, D.C. The average education and the like of employees of federal agencies tends to be higher than state agencies. And certainly, technical expertise itself has certain public good characteristics. If we're going to research the effects of arsenic on cancer rates, arsenic in drinking water on cancer rates, it doesn't make any sense to do that study 50 times, once in each state. Having it done once is certainly enough. Technical expertise can certainly inform our environmental choices, but it's not clear how the expertise actually translates into being better able to make what is ultimately the normative judgment about what our policy should look like. Is a 1 in a million cancer risk too high or too low? Is the right level of air pollution in a given city 0.08 parts per million or 0.079 parts per million or 0.75 parts per million? Technical expertise might help us understand those trade-offs of those different standards. But it doesn't really tell us which one we should adopt. But there are arguments made a lot of the idea of race to the bottom, the idea that states are going to compete with one another for business, for investment, and they're going to do that in part by lowering their regulations, and they're going to keep doing that, and that's going to put downward pressure on regulations. The problem is that we don't see this. There are now dozens of studies, the economic literature and political science literature, trying to find a race to the bottom in environmental policy. They cannot find it. There was a paper just published, I think, in JEL literature survey. We published one in Case Western Reserve Law Review literature survey looking at the empirical literature. We don't find any evidence of it. And in fact, what I told you about, some of the things I told you about in the beginning, are in fact evidence of the opposite. The pattern of regulation of wetlands at the state level is the exact opposite of the pattern we would expect if states were competing with one another by lowering regulatory standards. The states that should have regulated last regulated first. States that have the most to lose economically from burdening the development of wetlands were those that regulated first. They obviously saw value in protecting those resources that was greater than the economic costs of doing so. There's also an argument, for time we don't get into, that the idea of solving a race to the bottom with a federal floor in many instances actually doesn't. That floor actually, in practice, often becomes a ceiling, whether it's supposed to or not. It can actually reduce the extent to which states adopt measures for time reasons. I'll get by them. But what we have today, when we think about the reasons we should want to have federal intervention in environmental policy, is a bit of a mismatch. We've centralized a lot of things, like local drinking water, like local and regionalized environmental quality. And we've ignored areas where federal intervention would make sense, spillovers in particular, including problems like climate change, where the ability of states to do something is close to zero, and where the federal government has, for the most part, been quite absent. We actually have a mismatch between where federal intervention would make sense in environmental policy and where we actually get federal intervention. What would I do if it were up to me? What would be the ideal federal role? Focusing on its strengths, scientific research because of the public good characteristics of that, and focusing on interstate spillovers. I think it's important the federal government clarify the boundaries of federal environmental regulation. One of the problems we see in a lot of areas is if it's not clear where federal regulation ends, then it's not clear to state and local governments where their responsibility begins. For those of you that are following the debate over the various iterations of the WOTUS rule, the Waters of the United States rule, that's a big problem there. If we want states to continue their traditional role in protecting things like wetlands, they have to know what resources will only be protected by states. And federal government will not. And then we need to create more opportunities for experimentation. I have a paper in a forthcoming book that talks about ways to create mechanisms within our federal environmental laws to allow states to experiment more broadly than they do today. The idea being that we benefited a lot from the experimentation we saw in the states in the 1960s, but we want to continue to have that sort of experimentation and while we allow the federal government to focus on things that the federal government is in a better position to do in the states. One caveat on all of this, There's no going back to the Garden of Eden. Environmental problems are with us and will continue to be with us. Human civilization necessarily involves massive effects on the world around us. When we're evaluating, should the federal government do something versus state and local governments? Should we have a regulation? Should we have something else? Should we rely on non-market institutions? Whatever we're evaluating from a policy standpoint, we have to recognize that we are always choosing between less than perfect alternatives. We're not talking about what is the perfect solution. We're often not even talking about what's the best solution. We're talking about, okay, which is the 5th best and which is the 12th best. And part of what I'm arguing is that we have, the way we've dealt with environmental policy over the last 50 years, we have relied too heavily on the federal government for the wrong things and not done enough to try and get the benefits of greater decentralization. Federalism and environmental policy. My claim is not that that will produce environmental perfection, but that will do a better or perhaps just a less bad job at trying to solve the environmental problems that matter to us today and the environmental problems that we're not even yet aware of that will matter to our children and grandchildren. And I think that's my last slide, so I will stop there. So I'm happy to take questions and comments until Professor Unai tells me I have to stop. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? I have to say something that was provocative to someone. Oh.
Have you studied eco-criticism?
Studied what?
Eco-criticism?
In terms of literary criticism? Not other than in a very amateur way. I mean, because of the work I did on wetlands, I'm familiar with the way those ecosystems are described in literature. Is a very powerful way of understanding, as a cultural matter, how we viewed that. And so, for example, in the case of, you can look at like old cartoons, old Disney movies, and the witch always is in a swamp. And it's a very dark place, and there are snakes, and there are alligators, and it's threatening, and it's foreboding. And you certainly see similar things the way forests were characterized in a lot of old literature. And today we look at that, and we don't say swamps, we say wetlands. We talk, and we use terms that actually characterize the ecological functions that those places provide. And so I think it's a useful way of understanding how, if we want to understand our environmental history, we have to understand how our perceptions of the world around us and what we recognize in it affects whether we try and protect anything there. And I think it's useful. I mean, it's far from my areas of expertise, but I think it is useful because there are all sorts of things that are very important to us environmentally today that we not only didn't understand scientifically, but just relate to things we didn't value. The number of species that we pushed close to the threat of extinction because we didn't recognize their role in ecosystems, and we saw them merely as predators, merely as nuisance species or whatever else. And that gets reflected in the way we talked about them, the way we represented them in literature. Yes, sir.
Given, as you said, there's not a perfect solution. Just thinking about federal level, how well has it worked? How well would it have worked at the state level? Given that, just thinking about the arguments that you presented there, and you even mentioned, that maybe some of the push for federalism came out of the experience of, say, things that motivated civil rights legislation at the federal level. A lot of those same arguments are exactly the same arguments that were given to that, and I guess I have a feeling about, and where do you draw the line? How do you quickly analyze? Should we analyze? Maybe it's not the state level. Maybe it should be the city level. Maybe it's the individual landowner. And the number of individual landowners who I talk to say, hey, if there's somebody who should care about protecting this land, it's me. And then they go on not to do it because the economic pressures and the choice to bear the costs, are just too much for people to do in the short term.
So a couple of things. One is always compared to what, right? And it's easy to look at any particular situation and say, look at the failures. And we're not going to have any set of institutional arrangements that's not going to produce some failures. And I sometimes feel like that, when I give these sorts of talks, there's not this great uplift at the end because part of what I think is important for us to realize is that these issues are hard, and we're always going to want to do better. When we're talking about what levels of government, I mean, one of the reasons we focus on states is not because states have any particular ecological significance. It's because those are the jurisdictional boundaries we have. And they're like puzzle pieces, and we can kind of put them together. And we have ways of, for example, combining states with interstate compacts and the like, and ways of dealing with problems that are interstate but that are not national. And there were some examples of that beginning to happen for some water quality issues in the 50s and 60s. Most of the successful compacts we have on environmental issues relate to things like water quantity as opposed to quality. But there are, Lake Tahoe which is governed by an entity that was created by an interstate compact between Nevada and California. In general, my view of things that cross jurisdictional boundaries, the same principles apply when you're talking about landowners and when you're talking about political jurisdictions, right? You have very powerful incentives to care about the things that are visited within your jurisdictional boundaries, and very little incentive to care about what you're exporting to your neighbor, unless there is an institutional mechanism that holds you accountable. And when we're talking about individual landowners, historically we relied on things like nuisance law. There are ways in which nuisance law was good, there are ways in which it was inadequate, and ways in which our regulations may or may not have reinforced that to prevent landowner A from harming landowner B. I tend to think that focusing on that aspect of the problem tends to work better than trying to assume we know how both landowner and landowner B should be making their decisions, or what sorts of decisions, management decisions they should be making. But a lot of times it depends on the specific issue. Should the city of Cleveland be able to do something different than the city of Columbus? Sure. I could give you a whole long spiel about why the Cuyahoga River is actually a very unique river that is prone to certain sorts of problems that are different than other rivers in other parts of the state. You may not care that much about the Cuyahoga River, but it means that there are things we want to do differently when it comes to the Cuyahoga than we want to do with other rivers. And the more we allow different jurisdictions to account for their differences and the choices they make, I think the more likely we are to find the approach that fits best or fits least poorly. I also think we're more likely to discover more quickly when that is not working. And I think the federal government certainly has a role in helping inform folks about the consequences of their decision. If you make this decision about parts per million of ozone in the air, here's what the health effects of that are, and here's what the marginal effects are, how they change if you have a slightly looser or slightly more stringent standard. I think it's important to make sure those decisions are as informed as possible. But it's not clear that we somehow maximize welfare if we say that everybody has to have 0.08, not allowing anyone to have 0.079 or not allowing anyone to have 0.081. That's ultimately a normative policy choice that we want to have be informed by. Last thing that was buried in your question, and this is a long answer. There are aspects of environmental problems which implicate the same concerns that drove the civil rights movement in the 60s that you mentioned, the lack of respect for people and their property and their rights. And there are environmental aspects of that. So jurisdictions that used to say to communities, because you are poor, or because you're black, or because you're not politically powerful, or because of this, we are going to use state power to put the dirtiest factory or the hazardous waste disposal site in your community. Yeah, that's a problem. And in a lot of instances, that was done in ways which violate civil rights in similar ways to lots of other things that governments were doing. And one of the reasons we have a 14th Amendment, one of the reasons we in many ways transformed our constitutional structure in the 19th century is because we realized that whatever the value of decentralized governance is, there are limits that have to be placed on that, and there are certain systematic failures that we expect at that level, and we want to guard against that. And I don't think, just because the problem changes from where people are allowed to work or where they're allowed to eat dinner to what happens environmentally, doesn't change that dynamic. So I would think you deal with a lot of those issues in similar ways, and there are court decisions out there that point out that certain types of government interventions that prevent property owners from having traditional protection, defenses or protections of their property are takings of their property, just as if you want to take Suzette Kilo's pink house and give it to a corporation. That if we respect these underlying rights, we're protecting them in the environment context. That's, as
It sounds to me like you had some cognition that there's maybe a mix of federal, state, local, individual sort of attempts to improve the environment, and that there are significant differences on the environment's ability to absorb different things. But it sounded like there was a little bit of a de-emphasis on the federal part of it, but the spillover effects still seem to be pervasive. Just take a couple of examples, and I don't want it to just be examples, but think about lead in gasoline, lead in paint. Think about
one of those had spillovers, one did not.
Right. But, well, yeah, the lead in the gasoline.
Right.
And it's pervasive because we've got issues. We also have what we flush down the toilet, what we have in our water, it goes into our streams. If we didn't have some sort of federal regulation, sometimes cities on Missouri River, Mississippi River, and things like that would effectively dump their effluent down to people downstream. So it seems to me that sometimes the federal government really needs to be there because the states aren't going to be able to do it.
Interstate spillovers are incredibly strong, existence of interstate spillovers is an incredibly strong argument for federal intervention. If you got out the portions of the U.S. code that deal with the environment, started going, most of it's in Title 42 for those that care, started going through it, right? That's why it's in Title 33. You would go through, you go page after page after page after page, where there's no discussion of spillovers, no attention to spillovers, where what we are actually doing is in no way tailored to or focused on the spillover aspect of the issue. And lots of pages that deal with telling local communities what marginal trade-offs on the margin they need to make. And if you look especially at the first generation of federal environmental laws, incredibly little attention to spillovers, and the little bit of attention there was, those provisions weren't invoked, they weren't enforced. So the argument is not that there aren't spillovers. There are spillovers. The argument isn't that we shouldn't address them. We should. The argument is if we look at what we have today, very little of it is focused on spillovers. Maybe 20%, and a lot of that's relatively recent vintage. And there are other spillovers, climate change being one of them, where we're still doing close to nothing. So it's not that the federal government shouldn't be involved. It's that the federal government should be focused, just as if you think about the way the Constitution was structured, the enumeration of powers in Article 1, Section 8 was a late 18th century attempt to identify what are the sorts of governmental powers that are better exercised at a national level as opposed to a local level. The default assumption, property law is local, is state law. Contract law is state law. Tort law is state law. Criminal law is state law. Family law is state law. But there are some things that we want it to be national. And we realized in the mid-19th century after the Civil War that we hadn't quite gotten that balance right and we needed to shift it a little. But the idea was we're trying to identify certain things where the federal government is either in a better position to solve the problem. The federal government's going to care more about what Ohio does to New York than Ohio does. And New York on its own can't solve that problem unless there is some federal mechanism. And there may be areas in where we think there are systematic malfunctions of the way governments operate when it comes to prejudice, which is certainly part of what informed the 14th Amendment, 13th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. But that's the inquiry. I mean, in some respects, I'm saying if you want to do a similar sort of inquiry, there are certain sorts of environmental problems where the federal government is in a better position and where we need that. And there are certain environmental problems where it isn't. And we have limited resources. There are a limited number of people that are going to work in EPA. Congress is only going to give them so much money. And if we want them to actually help solve the problems, where if it's not the federal government, we're going to be kind of stuck, we want them focused on those problems. And that's not what we've done. It's not what we started doing in the 1970s, and that legacy is still with us today, because most of the environmental statutes we have look a lot like they looked in the 1970s. I mean, we've had a few changes in the 80s. Clean Air Act was last revised in 1990. We haven't really, what?
The Clean Water Act as well.
Clean Water Act was, I guess, last revised in '86, I think, but it's been a long time. Yeah, I mean, the point is that we have this architecture that was based on this fable, a misunderstanding of the relative role of the federal state governments. As a consequence, we have this mismatch. We have a federal architecture that isn't doing what it could be doing, both because it's doing too many things where it's less needed and too few things where it's more needed. And thinking about the relative, both the history and then the relative strengths of both the federal government and state governments is a way I hope that we can try and get something that's at least closer to each being in a position to do a better job. So that's really, so my claim is not, blow up EPA and get rid of the federal government. It's federal government should be dealing with things that are legitimately federal. And other things we want to leave to institutions at other levels. And I've probably gone on too long. Trust you guys didn't get the hook out. So thank you for your attention on this evening. And I'll turn it back to Professor Unna. Thank you, everybody.